Okay, tonight's class is on the bounty payments for cod fisheries debate of 1792. Now, I always include this one in here to show how far away from the founding of the Constitution we've gotten through the 20th century. Now, if you remember, in Federalist 41, I told you to remember a certain part of Federalist 41, didn't I? In which it says, "It has been urged and echoed that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States amounts to an unlimited commission to exercise every power which may be alleged to be necessary for the common defense or general welfare." This is an argument that the anti-federalists were making, right? And they were gaslighting. They said, well, you've got this in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and it gives Congress way too much power. No stronger proof could be given of the distress under which these writers labor for objections. So he's saying they're stretching for objections. Then they're stooping to such a misconstruction. Had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of the Congress been found in the Constitution than the general expression just cited, the authors of the objection might have had some color for it. So what he's saying is, if that had been the end, and there weren't other clauses added underneath that, then they might have had some argument. But they didn't have an argument. Though it would have been difficult to find a reason for so awkward a form of describing authority to legislate in all possible cases, a power to destroy the freedom of the press, the trial by jury, or even to regulate the course of dissents or the forms of conveyances must be very singularly expressed by the terms, quote, to raise money for the general welfare. But what color can the objection have when a specification of the objects alluded to by these general terms, immediately follows and is not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon? Okay, remember that was in Federalist 41. And Federalist 41 was published by Madison on Saturday, January 19th of 1788. Okay, now this is 1792. If your gazindas are correct, and they are, it's about 4 years later. Okay, so 4 years later, Madison wrote that, and it was agreed upon by Hamilton 4 years earlier than 1792. So let's go through the bounty payments for cod fisheries debate of 1792. On 3 February 1792, the Committee of the Whole began consideration of the bill for encouragement of the cod fisheries. As passed by the Senate, the first section of the bill replaced the existing drawback of the import duty on salt to exporters of salted fish with a new one based on tonnage to owners of fishing vessels. Debate on 6 February centered on the advantage which the bill bestowed on New England and stressed the importance of the fisheries as a source of trained sailors in case of war. Now you have to remember, back then, being a sailor was an extremely skilled trade. These vessels took many, many people to sail, and it took many, many people doing a specific job to make the vessel sail. So it was you couldn't just yank somebody off the street, put them on a ship, and they were a sailor. It didn't work like that. It was a very skilled trade. The very first tariff enacted in 1789 contained a provision for payments to the exports of dried and pickled fish. However, the real fervor over bounties did not erupt until early 1792, when Congress debated a law that repealed the 1789 payments and replaced it with direct payments to cod fishermen and their crews. The Senate bill proposed to repeal the 1789 system of payments and provided for paying to the owners of vessels employed in the cod fisheries a bounty based upon the size of their boats and the quantity of fish they landed to be divided among all their crew. So what was going on at the time that this was going on, remember the powers that were delegated to the federal government in the Constitution were war, peace, negotiation, and what? Foreign commerce, right? So foreign commerce, they were putting a huge tax on the salt that was coming in because we owed France $7 million. And who was the Secretary of Treasury? Hamilton. Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. So he realized that this money coming in was causing a lot of the ship captains to take money away from the crew to pay this commerce tax, okay? Well, what was happening is these skilled tradesmen in the cod fisheries, when they started losing money and they realized they could come inland and work agriculture for more money, what happens? We start losing a skilled trade. And that skilled trade was necessary in a time of war because where did we get a lot of our sailors from during times of war? Merchant mariners. Because it was a highly skilled trade. So Madison understood words. And bounty was the same word as what the word is that we use today as grants. Now Hamilton had just written an 83-page document 93-page document, I believe, don't quote me on that, on manufacturing, in which he talked about free trade as the laissez-faire free trade. Okay, so he wasn't much on the open market free trade. He felt that the government could collect taxes and then pay them out in bounties to make winners and losers so that we could get a manufacturing class started. Okay, Madison was against that. Madison understood that in the law, all the way from the Magna Carta 1215 that we studied, that when someone injures someone else in civil law, the law is there to make them whole again, right? Not make them rich, but to make them whole. Madison understood as a lawyer that even if the government was the entity that injured or harmed someone, that their job was to pay them an allowance to make them whole again, not to determine, not pay a bounty or a grant or take the emolument of giving a bounty to someone, that they shouldn't get credit for that, but they should only make them whole. So even though this bill was going to pass, and if it was going to pass, the same thing was going to happen, whether they changed the word bounty to the word I just used that I just forgot. No, an allowance. The same thing was going to happen. However, Madison was very keen on words, and that words have meanings. And if they changed it to an allowance, then they wouldn't be going down a rabbit hole that they shouldn't go down. Because the main argument in this whole thing was that the word general welfare gave somehow power to Congress, and not that it was the enumerated powers between Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 18, but that somehow at the end of Clause 1 of Article 1, Section 8, that somehow it bestowed more power on Congress than what the enumerated powers did. And in 41, Madison explains that those are general terms. They're not enumerated powers. That the general terms explained, that the general terms explained the enumerated powers found in clauses 2 through 18, right? So, the debate was a culmination of divided feelings stemming from Hamilton's report on manufacturers. Hamilton's famous report on the subject of manufacturers has cast a long shadow over U.S. trade policy toward industry, issued in December of 1791. The report not only provided theoretical justifications for the promotion of domestic manufacturing, but as a policy document made specific proposals for government action. These proposals included higher import duties on certain final goods, lower import duties on certain raw materials, pecuniary bounties, production subsidies for selected industries, and government assistance for the immigration of skilled workers, among other measures. To this day, the report is often heralded as the quintessential American statement against the laissez-faire doctrine of free trade and for activist government policies, including protectionist tariffs to promote industrialization. So do you see why I call Hamilton the first Democrat? Because this very ideology pollutes our trade agreements today. Alexander Hamilton's report on manufactures of 1791 is a classic document of U.S. economic policy, but its fate in Congress is not well known. It is commonly believed that the report was never implemented, although Hamilton's proposals for bounties, subsidies, what we know as grants now, failed to receive support. Virtually every tariff recommendation was adopted by Congress in early 1792. These tariffs were not highly protectionist because Hamilton feared discouraging imports, which were the critical tax base on which he planned to fund the public debt. As a consequence, protectionist interests shifted their political support from the Federalists to the Jeffersonian Republicans during the 1790s. Congress apparently tabled Hamilton's report after receiving it with no clear indication of when it would be taken up for debate, whenever that debate was to take place. However, James Madison in the House and Thomas Jefferson in the cabinet were preparing to fight it. Madison and Jefferson believed that bounties were unconstitutional and, if enacted, would set a dangerous precedent. Hamilton anticipated this objection in the report, noting that Congress had the express authority under the Constitution, quote, to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare, end quote. In Hamilton's view, the phrase, quote, general welfare, end quote, was as comprehensive as any that could have been used and necessarily embraces a vast variety of particulars. Therefore, it was of necessity left to the discretion of the national legislature to pronounce upon the object which concerned the general welfare and for which under that description an appropriation of money is requisite and proper. So what he's saying is Hamilton's belief, which it wasn't 4 years earlier, that in the general welfare or common defense was left up completely solely to the legislature to decide what object was for the general welfare and for them to be able to collect money and to provide for whatever they believed was for the common welfare or general welfare and common defense. Now you can see how dangerous that is. Madison combats that very handily. In fact, he quotes some of what he quoted in Federalist 41 on the floor of Congress during this debate. Madison contested this interpretation as he wrote to a colleague in January of 1792, less than a month after the report was issued. Quote, what do you think of the commentary, pages 36 and 37, on the terms general welfare? The federal government has been hitherto limited to the specified powers by the greatest champions for latitude in expounding those powers. If not only the means, but the objects are unlimited, the parchment had better be thrown into the fire at once. End quote. So what he's saying is, if that's the case, the Constitution's nothing more than a piece of paper. It means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. And that's what the progressives have been trying to do to the Constitution since 1913, is render it to be nothing more than a piece of paper. To another correspondent, Madison complained that because Hamilton's report, quote, broaches a new constitutional doctrine of vast consequence in demanding the serious attention of the public, I consider it myself as subverting the fundamental and characteristic principle of the government, as contrary to the true and fair, as well as the received construction, as a binding defiance to the sense in which the Constitution is known to have been proposed, advocated, and adopted. If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions. Think about that.
That's where we are today.
That's exactly where we are today.
Exactly.
Madison was correct. Jefferson plotted against the report using a similar line of argument. In a February 1792 memo prepared for himself, notes on the constitutionality of bounties to encourage manufacturing, Jefferson stated that import duties were the principal means of promoting manufactures. Quote, bounties have in some instances been a successful instrument for the introduction of new and useful manufactures, but the use of them has been found almost inseparable from abuse. What do we know about grants today? Abuse. The power of dispersing them has not been delegated by the Constitution to the general government. It remains with the state governments, whose local information renders them competent judges of the particular arts of manufactures for which circumstances have matured them. End quote. These notes may have been made in preparation for a meeting that Jefferson had with President Washington later that month. In his account of that meeting, Jefferson attacked the report on manufactures, which under color of, and there again, C-O-L-O-U-R, okay, under color of giving bounties for the encouragement of particular manufacturers, meant to establish the doctrine that the power given by the Constitution to collect taxes to provide for the general welfare of the U.S. permitted Congress to take everything under their management which they should deem for the public welfare and which is susceptible of the application of money. According to Jefferson's notes on the meeting, the conversation ended there without any apparent reaction from Washington. Jefferson's Brit-bashing project went badly awry. Although Congress agreed there was a problem, it decided to fashion a remedy entirely different from that envisioned by the sage of Monticello. On January 11, 1792, the Senate passed and sent to the House a bill entitled An Act for the Encouragement of the Bank and Other Cod Fisheries, and for the regulation and government of the fishermen employed therein. For it was James Madison who stepped into the breach to fashion a compromise that exalted form over substance. Congress did not have power under the Constitution, Madison gravely declared, to grant bounties. This became known as the bounty payments to cod fisheries debate of 6 February 1792. This was Madison's speech on the floor of the House. In the conflict I feel between my disposition on one hand to afford every constitutional encouragement to the fisheries, and my dislike on the other of the consequences apprehended from some clauses in the bill, I should have forebone to enter into this discussion, if I had not found that over and above such arguments as appear to be natural and pertinent to the subject, others have been introduced, which are, in my judgment, contrary to the true meaning and even strike at the characteristic principles of the Constitution. Let me premise, however, to the remarks which I shall briefly offer on the doctrine maintained by these gentlemen. And that doctrine that's maintained by those gentlemen is that the phrase general welfare gives Congress power. Let me premise, however, to the remarks which I shall briefly offer on the doctrine maintained by these gentlemen, that I make a material distinction in the present case between an allowance as a mere commutation and modification of a drawback and an allowance in the nature of a real and positive bounty. So what he's talking about is words have meanings, and are we giving a grant, or are we simply making these people whole because we, with our policies, injured them? That's the argument. That's the true argument. I make a distinction also, as a subject of fair consideration at least, between a bounty granted under the particular terms in the Constitution, a power to regulate trade, and one granted under the indefinite terms which have been cited as authority on this occasion. I think, however, that the term bounty is in every point of view improper as it is here applied, not only because it may be offensive to some, and in the opinion of others carries a dangerous implication, but also because it does not express the true intention of the bill as avowed and advocated by its patrons themselves. For if, in the allowance, nothing more is proposed than a mere reimbursement of a sum advanced, it is only paying a debt, and when we pay a debt, we ought not to claim the merit of granting a bounty. It is supposed by some gentlemen that Congress have authority not only to grant bounties in the sense here used, merely as a commutation for drawbacks, but even to grant them under a power by virtue of which they may do anything which they may think conducive to the, quote, general welfare, end quote. This, sir, in my mind, raises the important and fundamental question whether the general terms which have been cited are to be considered as a sort of caption or general description of the specified powers, and as having no further meaning and giving no further power than what is found in that specification, or as an abstract and indefinite delegation of power extending to all cases whatever, to all such at least as will admit the application of money, which is giving as much latitude as any government could well desire. Think of that. If they get to decide what is the general welfare, and money can be put to it, and they have the ability to raise taxes for it, then that's more power than any government could ever wish for. I, sir, have always conceived, I believe those who proposed the Constitution conceived, it is still more fully known and more material to observe those who ratified the Constitution conceived, that this is not an indefinite government deriving its powers from the general terms prefixed to the specified powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general terms. So what are the specified powers? What are the limited enumerated powers of government? Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 18. That's it. If it doesn't say it there, Congress has no power to make any law or decision or debate on the issue. The gentlemen who contend for a contrary doctrine are surely not aware of the consequences which flow from it, and which they must either admit or give up their doctrine. So he's saying, here's some consequences that can happen. And if you guys aren't going to admit that these are the consequences that are going to happen, then if you believe these consequences are going to happen, or if you agree with me, then you have to give up your doctrine. The doctrine that the general welfare and common defense grant powers other than the enumerated powers. It's exactly what he's telling them. So if you agree with me, then you have to give up this nonsense that grants power, because it's nonsense. It will follow in the first place that if the terms be taken in the broad sense they maintain, the particular powers afterwards, so carefully and distinctly enumerated, would be without meaning and must go for nothing. So why, if they're going to put in Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 at the end for the general welfare and common defense, why would there be any other powers after that? Because there wouldn't need to be, because they've already given Congress all the power any government would wish to have. Right? That's what he's saying. It would be absurd to say, first, that Congress may do what they please, which is in Clause 1, and then that they may do this or that particular thing, which is in Clauses 2 through 18. After giving Congress power to raise money and apply it to all purposes which they may pronounce necessary to the general welfare, it would be absurd to say the least, to superadd a power to raise armies, to provide fleets, etc. In fact, the meaning of the general terms in question must either be sought in the subsequent enumerations, which limits and details them, or they convert the government from one limited as hitherto supposed to the enumerated powers into a government without any limits at all. Do you see where we are today? It is to be recollected that the terms common defense and general welfare are here used are not novel terms first introduced into this Constitution. They are terms familiar in their construction and well known to the people of America. In fact, the same argument was in Federalist 41. They are repeatedly found in the old Articles of Confederation, where, although they are susceptible of as great latitude as can be given them by the context here, it was never supposed or pretended that they conveyed any such powers as is now assigned to them. Isn't that interesting? He's going, these aren't novel terms. We had them in the Articles of Confederation. And yet none of you argued that it gave power to that impotent government, right? And it was so impotent that they couldn't get uniforms or bullets or beans to the soldiers fighting in Washington's army. That's how impotent that government was. Well, if those terms were in the Articles of Confederation, then there's absolutely no reason why that government would be impotent, would it? Because they would have had all the power any government could wish. But they never argued that it gave them power. On the contrary, it was always considered as clear and certain that the old Congress was limited to the enumerated powers, and that the enumeration limited and explained the general terms. I ask the gentlemen themselves whether it ever was supposed or suspected that the old Congress could give away the money of the states and bounties to encourage agriculture or for any other purpose they pleased. If such a power had been possessed by that body, it would have been less impotent or have borne a very different character from that universally ascribed to it. Right? Universally it was ascribed that it was an impotent government. That's the reason why they put the delegation together to go to Pennsylvania, because they said, look, this thing isn't working. These Articles of Confederation aren't working. The one branch of federal government we have is broken. It's impotent. But if they had those terms then, why was it impotent? That's a pretty good argument, I think. If these aren't novel terms, if they were in the Articles of Confederation, why weren't you guys arguing it then? Because you understood then that they were the general terms. They didn't confer any power to government. The limited, enumerated powers are all that government had. The novel idea now annexed to those terms and never before entertained by the friends or enemies of the government. Friends or enemies? Federalists and anti-federalists. Will have a further consequence which cannot have been taken into the view of the gentleman. Their construction would not only give Congress the complete legislative power I have stated, pay very close attention to this, it would do more. It would supersede all the restrictions understood at present to lie on their power with respect to a judiciary. It would put in the power of Congress to establish courts throughout the United States with cognizance of suits between citizens and citizens, and in all cases whatsoever. This, sir, seems to be demonstrable. For if the clause in question really authorizes Congress to do whatever they think fit, provided it be for the general welfare, of which they are to judge, and money can be applied to it, Congress must have power to create and support a judiciary establishment with a jurisdiction extending to all cases favorable, in their opinion, to the general welfare, in the same manner as they have power to pass